Okay, thank you for the invitation uh, for this nice series of conferences or of lectures. I will discuss about the relationship between the Bosporan Kingdom and Arcadia in the time of Leukon I. It will be a discussion that will show that the connection between these two regions and these two polities was based on more than one of the two items, grain and mercenaries, as it was stated before in the literature, and in fact that both resources, military manpower, and foodstuff were important for this relationship. The discussion will start from 4 fragmentary inscriptions, and this will make my presentation resemble a little bit with the famous meme on Facebook about how archaeologists, historians are reconstructing a lot from just scraps of evidence, of course, being in peril of speculating a lot. I hope it won't be the case. So as you can see, the two regions are quite far apart from a geographical point of view, but these two resources, grain and military manpower, I think that I will be able to state that were very important elements and led to their connection. Before starting properly the discussion, I want to say that this presentation is made in the memory of my professor, Alexandru Avram, an eminent epigraphist, also a very important historian and archaeologist. And this is because I discussed about this topic with him just a few days between his untimely death in Histria, and he encouraged me to pursue this subject that he also briefly approached in the Bulletin Epigraphique. I want to emphasize from the very beginning that the main perspective of this presentation is not an epigraphic one, although I start from inscriptions and I will present a discussion on these inscriptions, and I will make also some epigraphic remarks of my own. It is not from the point of view of the Pontic historian. The Bosporan Kingdom is not my specialization, although I tried to become familiar with its history and archaeology for this presentation. And for the paper that will appear, I hope shortly will be published in a volume dedicated to the memory of Alexandru Avram. It is from the point of view of someone who studied Aegean mercenaries in the archaic period, but also I had to study them in the classical period. And I think that larger knowledge on this topic that involves a lot of the history of international relations and military history could bring some new light on the issue of these 4 inscriptions and the relationship between Arcadia and the Bosporan Kingdom in the first half of the 4th century BC. I don't know how much people in the audience are familiar with both the Bosporan Kingdom and Arcadia, so I added a short introduction about these polities. So the Bosporan Kingdom is one of the long-lived states of antiquity, starting in the 5th century BC and going to at least the mid-4th century AD, if not even further. And the most important independent dynasty was that of the Spartacidae, named after Spartacus the First. There are some opinions that he was a Thracian mercenary because the name has some Thracian overtones. But it is not about him that we will discuss this evening. The main character is Leukon I, his grandson, and I think he could really be considered the founder of the power, of the real strength of this kingdom. He started from Pantikapaion, and there is a huge discussion on his titles. One of the most extended versions make him Archon of Bosporus, Theodosia, and in some versions King of Syndike and of Toretai, Dandarion, and Psesoi, barbarians from the Taban Peninsula. His main achievements were the conquest of Theodosia after protracted wars against Heraclea Pontica and possibly Chersonesus, and of course Theodosia itself. So this happened in the west of his kingdom, and also in the east of his kingdom he started the conquest of the Taman Peninsula. His most precious achievement was the conquest of Syndike, but also of the other barbarians mentioned, aforementioned, and he did this by having also very astute foreign policy, which clearly involved friendly relations with Athens, and as we will see, possibly with Olbia too. One of the main assets of Leukon I, but of all the Spartakids, was the grain produced in the area. I know it sounds familiar maybe to you because of contemporary events, and this is shown both in literary sources and in epigraphic evidence. There are two important cities that are connected to Bosporus through this grain connection. The first one is Athens, and we have a very important passage from Demosthenes' speech against Leptines that showed the importance of the grain bought in the Bosporan Kingdom with tax exemptions for Athens, and also an inscription, a honorary decree for Spartacus and Perisades, the sons and successors of Leukon I, that show that for the Athenians, the most important dimension of the relation with the Bosporan Kingdom was the export of grain from that area to Athens. And a very similar situation, although less documented, might take place in Mytilene. There are also sources, literary and epigraphic sources for Mytilene, and it's very interesting that the import of grain from the Pontic region in Mytilene is already attested in 438 BC. And as a parenthesis, I think that in the discussion, when the grain trade between the Pontic region and the Aegean region started, I think that based on the famous mention in Herodotus and also on this passage and Thucydides, we can reliably admit that in the 5th century, this grain trade was already important. On the other hand, Arcadia was a poor mountainous and landlocked region of Peloponnesus, which its inhabitants and the region itself had some very famous attributes. They become something like very used expressions for describing them. The corn eaters and are the inhabitants, and the region is renowned for being rich in flocks. It's already mentioned about Orchomenus in Homer Iliad. So a region where agriculture was not that important, but apparently pastoralism and also hunting and gathering were more important than in other regions of Greece. However, where the conditions were met and there were important plains like in the eastern of Arcadia, there were cities, typical poleis like Mantinea and Tegea, the two most important cities of Arcadia, and a little bit north Orchomenus. But in the more mountainous regions, there were districts with the rural settlements, no urban life, like the districts of Mainalia and Parhasia. The region was under constant threat by Sparta, and they fought a lot in the 7th and the 6th century BC, and in the second half of the 6th century BC, the Arcadians became members of the Peloponnesian League, recognizing the supremacy of Sparta. This supremacy they were able to overthrow only after the Battle of Leuctra, and at that time they started their own league, their own koinon in 370 BC. They were led by important leaders, very astute politicians like Lycomedes of Mantinea, who was assassinated in 366 BC, and Aeneas of Stymphalus, a very apt general. And they won great victories against the Spartans, the Eleans, the Sicyonians, based apparently also on a very important group of shock troops, the Eparitoi, professional soldiers. Diodorus says that they were 5,000, but it is most probably that they were far less than that. Unfortunately, for the Arkadians, the interests were divergent between the southern Arkadians who wanted to oppose Sparta and the northern Arkadians who were not very happy with the Theban supremacy. So in 362 BC, the league was split, and in fact they fought each other at the Great Battle of Mantinea. There was apparently afterwards a northern league that was centered on Mantinea, and then the southern states mostly centered around the newly established city of Megalopolis. Great Arkadian League starts again in 330 BC after the victory of Philip II of Macedon at Chaeronea. I want to share with you a personal impression after visiting for a few times Arcadia. Indeed, it's a very rough terrain and very poor. Even now, on modern roads and with modern cars, it's still a very difficult region to cross. So this explains why in antiquity the Arcadians were not united, and whenever there was important demographic boom, the people had to leave this region, and most of the time they became mercenaries. And this brings us to the second part of the description of Arcadia, the Arkadian mercenaries. The first, let's say, reliable mention of Arkadians seeking employment as mercenaries is in 480 BC. It's provided by Herodotus. Some Arkadians, which were late for the Battle of Thermopylae, apparently asked Xerxes to recruit them as mercenaries. They were also mentioned in under the tyrants of Syracuse. They appear in the Peloponnesian War in many places, from Potidea to Ionia and East Greece generally. During the Athenian expedition in Sicily, they fight on both sides, and this is specifically written down by Thucydides. And the greatest ethnicity in the regional ethnicity in the 10,000 that went to Kunax and then back to Greece is that of the Arkadians. the information in Xenophon allows us to estimate their number at 4,000, which is really a big number, both for the 10,000 themselves, but also when compared to the total demographic power, let's say, of Arcadia. And of course, in the 4th century, there are even more mentions of Arcadian mercenaries. We will see that only in the Hellenistic period, Arcadia stopped being an important recruiting ground for mercenaries. But for the classical period, they were one of the most famous areas for recruiting mercenaries. They become proverbial as mercenaries, and this was not only a perspective from outside Arcadia, but it was also in the Arcadians themselves were self-conscious about this. I put there on the slide a fragment from a speech of Lycomedes, their great statesman, that said that whenever men needed mercenaries, none were chosen in preference to Arcadians. And apparently in Eastern Greece at that time, or at least in Lycia, hoplite became somehow synonymous with people from Arcadia, as shown by a dynast from Xanthos who boasts that he killed 7 hoplites, Arcadian men, in a day. So now we will, after this introduction, we will get back to the 4 inscription. I pictured here the 3 cities on the North Pontic shores where they were found, and also the 3 cities mentioned in these inscriptions as places where some Arcadians that had ties in the North Pontic area came from. The first inscription is the upper part of a stone where a decree was inscribed. It was found in Pantikapaion, near the Acropolis of Pantikapaion, already in 1829. And we know, because it is mentioned as the honorand, that it dates from the reign of Leukon I. Unfortunately, we only have part of the prescript. We know that the Arkadians decided that Leukon, son of Satyros, a Pantikapaion citizen, and then the stone is broken, unfortunately. The second stone is this time the lower part of a slab. It was found on the east of the Strait of Kerch in Phanagoria in the sea in 1901. It's a verse inscription, most likely, and probably a funerary epigram, not a dedicatory verse inscription. And based on the form of the letters and by contamination from the honorary decree for Leukon, it is dated in the first half of the 4th century BC. We can reliably see that it mentioned a gymnasium, and that the deceased, I will assume that it is a funerary epigram, that the deceased came from Mantinea. The third inscription is clearly a gravestone, a tombstone, written in Stoichedon with traces of red paint. It was also found in Phanagoria, this time clearly in the Western necropolis, and much recently in 1975. And it has the same dating conditions, let's say, and criteria like the previous one. And it just mentioned the name of the of the deceased, and his ethnonym, it's Pantias from Tegea. The last one comes from outside the Bosporan Kingdom, comes from Olbia, from the Eastern Temenos. It's a proxenate decree, the beginning of a proxenate decree that shows that proxeny was awarded to Aristandros, son of Melissus, an Orchomenian from Arcadia. Excuse me. So in this case, the dating is a little bit more secure because we can also add some stylistic features because of the pediment of the free acroteria. We can reliably state that it dates from the first half of the 1st century BC. And now I will show what were the discussions in the literature about these inscriptions. By far, the most discussed inscription is the honorary decree for Leukon. There were 3 theories. One of them, I think that we should discard it, although it can be discussed also that the Arkadians mentioned are in fact citizens of the polis of Arkades in Crete, but it is the less likely. However, the most important theories show that the first one, that it was issued by the Arkadian League through its assembly, and it should be related with benefactions granted by Leukon to the Arkadians. And it is based it is mostly based on parallels with the cases of Athens and Mytilene. We discussed about them before. On the other hand, starting with von Gertringen, a new theory emerged that based on some historical arguments, the renown of Arkadian mercenaries, the fact that Leukon had an expansionist policy and he needed lots of soldiers and very good soldiers, the fact that the use of mercenaries by the Spartacidae is attested in literary sources for a later period, the end of the 4th century BC, and apparently by 2 other epitaphs. And there is also an epigraphic argument. Gertringen showed that the enactment formula for the only known decree at that time issued by the Arkadian League was much more complex, mentioning also the bulle and the hoimirioi, the 10,000. This was the name, the formal name, in fact, for the assembly of the league. And this idea of Göttingen quite quickly became an orthodoxy. In the 1950s, it was already an orthodoxy that this decree should be connected with Arkadian mercenaries, and somehow a group of mercenaries who were at Pantikapaion and fighting for Leukon honored him with such a decree. However, Gaiduchevich in 1960 refuted this claim and discussed some epigraphic arguments. He said that that only known decree of the Arkadian League, the so-called Philarchos decree, because it's a decree awarding proxenia to an Athenian, Philarchos, should be dated after 338 BC. He also shown that a newly found inscription from Olympia might be reconstituted as having an enactment formula mentioning only the Arkades, that the Arkades Edokan. And he also said that no honorary decrees were issued by mercenaries. Moreover, another argument was that in the 4th century BC, there were shorter enactment formulas in the so-called abbreviated decrees. So at that time, it was very convincing, this discussion made by Gaiduchevich, and some researchers said that the case is closed. However, if we take a look, his arguments are not that strong, are not decisive, although they are important. For example, the first argument, the first epigraphic argument, could be discarded by the fact that it is possible, even probable, that the later Arkadian League revive the institution of the first Arkadian League, and then also the formulas used in the inscriptions might have been the same. The second one might be also discarded because the restoration is not that sure. There might be attempted some other restoration. The idea that there were no honorary decrees issued by mercenaries doesn't stand. In the Hellenistic period, there are many inscriptions, honorary decrees issued by mercenaries, but in the most the better known are in Sunion, in Lamnus, or in Attica, but also there are auxiliaries from Cretan and Achaia and Koina that makes honorary decrees for Hellenistic monarchs. And of course, there is a problem because there are no recorded examples when the enactment formula is edoxe plus the etnonym in dative, the simple etnonym in dative, but there are somehow some instances where they are quite close. Either it's tois stratiotais instead of the etnonym, or sometimes it's the etnonym but with some other determinative clauses around. The fourth argument of Gajdugiewicz was further developed in some comments made by my friend Dragoș Elmaci, one of the editors of the volume where this paper will be published. And I hope that he will be able to publish independently his arguments in a paper. He pointed out that those abbreviated and semi-abbreviated decrees granting proxeny were quite common in the 1st century in Greece. He found some of these decrees granting proxeny for some Arkadian polis, for Orchomenus and from Lucioi, are the ones who resemble the most the decree from Pantikapaion. Also, some decrees of the Hellenistic leagues of the Aetolians and the Epirots resemble this this decree for Leukon I, and his opinion is that this should be a non-problematic award of proxeny by the Arkadian League to Leukon I, also because taking a look at the new photographs published in the supplementum to the corpus of inscriptions from the Bosporan Kingdom, he thinks that he is able to see two letters on the 3rd line that could allow restoring the decree as a proxeny decree. I think this is quite possible, although there are some counter arguments. For example, the proxeny decree of the Arkadian League to Philarchos has another formula. The honorary decree for Leukon for Perisades and Spartocus issued by Athens respects the Athenian epigraphic formula, so we would expect that this honorary decree to Leukon also should have a larger formula, not an abbreviated one. But we will see. We hope that there will be new discoveries. For my argument, for my whole discussion, my approach, it is not really that important if the inscription was issued by mercenaries, by a group of mercenaries, or by the Arkadian League, or by, it is also another possibility that we could discuss by another Arkadian League, a smaller Arkadian League, for example, the Northern Arkadian League that appeared after 362. But I wanted to discuss this because this is the, let's say, the star of all the 4 inscriptions. And unfortunately, the discussion most of the time is restricted only to this one. The others are not discussed that much. But we could make some additional remarks on them. For example, the verse epitaph for the Arkadian who came from Mantinea I think it could be, there are some important chances to be related to a soldier, because if we take into account the Hellenistic verse epitaphs from mainland Greece, and we talk much about Hellenistic inscriptions because from the classical period, the inscriptions of this time, of this type are not that frequent. So in these Hellenistic verse epitaphs, in this collection, the largest category is the one of verse epitaphs made for soldiers. And in fact, patries is a frequent occurrence in these epitaphs, and particularly in relation with the with an Arkadian mercenary, a Cretan mercenary, an Illyrian mercenary, and with other soldiers. So we would expect in a in an epitaph to an Arkadian mercenary in the Bosporan Kingdom to have a reference to his patries. Also, the reference to the Gymnasian, this is speculative, but it should be said, from inscriptions might be made in connection with the athletic and martial prowess of the deceased, and also with the untimely death of a soldier. There are some instances about this, and more generally, the gymnasia were places where master and training took place, and there is one very important reference and quite famous about the training that Xenophon made to his troops, and we know that he had a lot of mercenaries that Agesilaus made for his troops during his campaign in Asia Minor. So there are some hints that could point that these inscriptions might have been erected for Arkadian mercenary. Moreover, if we discuss also the proxeny decree from Olbia, we see that outside the Pontic region, there are only 4 such proxeny decrees in the classical period. 2 of them are for Athenians, 1 for Boeotian, and only 1 for and this one for the North. So this is quite an unusual inscription. So it could have been, this proxeny was deserved by this Orchomenian because of the trade relations. It's a hardly credible hypothesis, because Orchomenius was one of the small poleis from Arcadia. It was landlocked, and the epigraphic record for this city shows that it had limited foreign relations in the 4th century BC, only some relations with central Greece, but not farther away. So once more, the decree in Olbia, it's very surprising. And it is more likely that if they made imports of grain, they were made through the mediation of Egina, or possibly of some Achaean ports like Helike. A citizen of Helike is mentioned, for example, in an inscription in the Pontic area. I think that it is much more attractive, the connection with an with an idea exposed by Vinogradov. This decree from Olbia is roughly contemporary with the honorary decree also found in Olbia for Satyros, the father of Leukon, and an alliance treaty between the Olbiopolitans and Leukon around 390 and 385 BC. And Vinogradov's idea is that an alliance of Bosporus and Olbia confronted and waged war against Theodosia, Heraclea, and Chersonesus. So I think that it is more likely, instead of an Arkadian merchant, to have an Arkadian leader of mercenaries in Bosporus that during these confrontations paid some service to the Olbiopolitans. But of course, as I told you, this is highly conjectural. What I'm more interested in is the fact connected with the general mechanism of mercenary activities. So first of all, it is not that uncommon to and not that surprising if there were mercenaries in the Bosporan Kingdom at this time, because already Arkadian mercenaries were on the shore of the Black Sea and could have been quite well known at that time. For example, the 10,000 that came back from from Asia on the southern shore of the Black Sea were also employed by Seutes II in Thrace. Moreover, Arkadian, a very, I would say, a tantalizing mention is one made by Pausanias, that some Arkadians from Peloponnese and Trapezus that didn't want to be part of the Sinoikismos of Megalopolis emigrated to Pontic Trapezus in 371 BC. Enea Tacticus, a writer of military treatises of the 4th century BC, who is quite reliably identified, in my opinion, with Aeneas the Stymphalian, one of the strategoi of the Arkadian League, seems to be very well informed on Leucon's bodyguards. The bodyguards of tyrants, of kings, were quite frequently made by mercenaries. And we see that there was no problem for the rulers of the Bosporan Kingdom to recruit people from the southern shores of the Pontic, from areas where the Arkadian mercenary were present at some time, for example, that Phanagoria and Rosanis. So I think that there was this possibility, this opportunity for the Bosporan rulers to recruit Arkadian mercenaries. That was not something very surprising. Moreover, if we take a look from the Arkadian perspective, we'd see that they were quite opportunistic and they were employed very far away from home, abroad, from Sicily to Thrace, from Sardis to Lycia, and probably even to Phoenicia, although the mention in Xenophon about a guard of a Persian satrap of Phoenicia doesn't mention Arkadians specifically, but mentions Greek mercenaries. It is quite possible making a comparison with the Arkadians at the same time in Cyrus the Younger's army, that also in this group there were Arkadians. So it wouldn't be surprising at all if a group of Arkadian mercenaries would have been recruited by Leukon I. And now I'll reach the main part of my historical argument, and the fact is that recent research on of Greek mercenaries activities show that employing mercenaries and recruiting mercenaries was not something like going to the supermarket or recruiting someone from LinkedIn. It was not something just contractual, just economic. Most of the time, the recruitment was part of a larger relationship between the recruiters and the polities or the regions that acted as recruiting grounds. The relationship between these two elements was much more complex. It involved political connections. It involved sometimes economic connections. It was not only the recruitment of mercenaries was only a part of this larger larger phenomenon of international relationship. And because of this, in the 4th century BC, particularly as the wars in Greece became more and more developed, more and more continuous, more and more professional, some Greek city-states or some Greek leagues had somehow to turn their citizen in official soldiers of fortune or in armies lent abroad. So there are some examples. For instance, Agesilaus and 30 Spartan advisors went to serve under Tahos and Necta Nebo in a very critical period for Sparta after the Battle of Mantinea of 362. And it is quite clear from what Plutarch says about Agesilaus' endeavor in Egypt that he went there because Sparta needed money for hiring mercenaries, and that the price of him going over there with the other Spartans for leading the mercenaries employed by the Egyptian rulers was 240 talents of silver for the war at home. A similar situation might be that of Pamenes, a Theban general. He's the one who, for example, had in his house Philip II of Macedon as a hostage, and he was dispatched by the Timpas with 5,000 soldiers for helping revolted satrap, the Artabasos in the Hellespont in Phrygia in his revolt against the great king. We should take notice that at that time Thebes was in an alliance with Persia. So it is quite possible that he went there not despite the war with the Phocians at that time, but the Third Sacred War, but particularly because of this war and the needs of money of the Theban state. And such an assumption is repeated in the case of Lacrates and 1,000 Boeotians that go to serve under Artaxerxes III in Egypt in 351 BC. And Julius Belloch made the assumption that two mentions in Diodorus Siculus' history of that year are in fact related. A gift of 300 talents of silver given by Artaxerxes to Thebes was not at all a gift, but in fact was the payment for the 1,000 hoplites that went to Egypt, and the state of Thebes was in necessity and accepted this because of the war against the Phocians. An even more interesting occurrence is one mentioned in a scholium to Aristophanes Plutus, and in this case there were the troops sent by the Athenians to a pharaoh of Egypt, most probably Ahoris, not Amasis, as wrongly stated in the scholium, when they're not for money in exchange, but for corn. So this would resemble a lot the situation that I propose was in place between Bosporan Kingdom and Arkadia. And it would be useful also to make a comparison with the situation and the ties between the Athenians and the Bosporan rulers. We have already seen that the most important aspect of the relation, at least in the Athenian, from the Athenian perspective, was that the rulers of the Bosporan Kingdom should look after the export of grain to Athens and to give exemptions and to help with in this wise. On the other hand, it is very interesting to mention that the Athenians obliged themselves to crown the two descendants of Leukon I with a gold crown at at every great Panathenaia, which was very funny because they granted this crown, but then the Bosporan rulers had to dedicate the crowns that they received in the temple of Athena Polias. But much more important than this rather anecdotic fact is the fact that they committed to give Hyperesiae to Spartocus and Perisade, Hyperesiae which were specifically asked for by the Bosporan rulers. Now there is a long discussion about what these Hyperesiae are. Maybe they were officer or maybe they were rowers. I think that in this case we should admit that they were naval officers, but it really doesn't matter. It shows that the Bosporan rulers really needed at that time professional naval staff for their navy, and they traded, let's say, grain for this naval personnel that they were in need for their in their expansionist policy. It's very interesting to note that this inscription shows quite clearly that it is not a situation that occurs only in the times of Spartacus II and Perisades I, but also in the times of Leukon and Satyros. So, having in mind these ideas about mercenary recruitment, being aware that Arcadia was not producing much food, and sometimes because of demographic boom, the people from Arcadia had to emigrate abroad, and most of the times to embrace the profession of arms. Given the fact that Xenophon clearly states that one of the reasons why the Arkadian League collapsed in 362 was that a conflict between the different parts of the league started arising from the need for payment for the eparitoi, things that really makes the case of the Arkadian League similar to that of Sparta or of Athens or of Thebes at roughly the same time. Moreover, taking into account that there were close connection between the Mantinean Democrats and some Athenian statesmen, I think that the riddle of these inscriptions could be better solved by inferring that, in fact, there was a quite complex relationship between Arcadia, and particularly the Arkadian League, and the Bosporan Kingdom. We shouldn't think in simple terms of all these peoples and all these people mentioned in the inscription and all these events should be related to the grain trade, or all this should be related to a group of mercenaries from Arcadia waging war under the command of Leukon I. I think that, in fact, there was a complex relationship similar to the one between the Bosporan Kingdom and Athens, and involved, in fact, an exchange of grain versus heavy infantry. And possibly it started already around 390 BC, before the emergence of the Arkadian League, if we take into account the decree from Olbia and all the assumptions that I made about it, the renown of the mercenaries after the 10,000 march, and also the high success that Seutes II had by employing them. So, but this is another discussion, the one about chronology. It is very difficult, and it is even more difficult than the one trying to separate and to focus on what was the base of this relation between the Arkadians and the Bosporan Kingdom. So that was my presentation. I hope it was not too long, and I am open for receiving questions, and hopefully I will be able to give you answers. If not, I will add even more questions to your questions and leave this for other researchers to struggle on them.